The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the weight of the man's words hanging heavy in the air. The riders were visibly shaken now, their earlier confidence evaporating. But instead of stepping down, the leader clenched his fists, doubling down on his mistake. "You think you can scare us?" he snapped. "We're not backing off just because you two showed up." The woman glanced over her shoulder at the man, her smile turning almost amused. "Looks like I still don't get it," she said softly. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "Guess we'll have to show them." The stakes had just been raised, and the air crackled with the promise that everything was about to come to a head. The leader squared his shoulders, his pride outweighing his better judgment. "All right then," he said, his voice loud and defiant, though his confidence seemed thinner now. "Let's see what you've got." Before anyone could move, the woman held up her hand, stopping the man behind her in his tracks. "No need," she said calmly, stepping forward. "This isn't about proving anything. It's about knowing when you've already lost." Her words hit harder than any punch, the crowd murmuring in agreement as her presence seemed to dwarf the leader's entire crew. But then she did something no one expected. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small patch, worn but unmistakable. It bore the insignia of a field medic's unit, the edges frayed from years of use. She held it up for everyone to see. "You think strength is about throwing punches or acting tough," she said, her voice carrying across the lot. "Real strength is about saving lives, not taking them. It's about knowing when to walk away, even when your pride is screaming at you to stay." The riders, who had been itching for a fight moments ago, now stood rooted in place, their bravado dissolving under the weight of her words. Even the leader faltered, his fists unclenching as he glanced at his crew, realizing they were no longer with him. But just as it seemed the tension had diffused, the woman stepped closer to the leader, her voice dropping low enough that only he could hear. "And if you still want to test me," she said, her tone ice-cold, "I can show you exactly what combat training looks like. But trust me, you won't walk away the same." The leader's face paled, the last shred of his bravado crumbling. He muttered something about needing to leave and gestured for his crew to follow. They shuffled back to their bikes, their earlier swagger replaced by silence. As the roar of their engines faded into the distance, the man behind her chuckled. "You really have a way with words," he said, shaking his head. She turned to him with a smirk. "Sometimes words are all it takes. Sometimes." The crowd began to disperse, the spell broken, but as the woman returned to her table, she noticed something tucked beneath her plate, a patch almost identical to hers. She picked it up, her eyes widening slightly as she looked back at the man. He gave her a knowing smile. "From one survivor to another," he said. "Figured you'd appreciate it." And with that, the story closed, leaving the diners with something they wouldn't forget. Not just the thrill of the confrontation, but the lesson hidden in its aftermath. The woman turned the patch over in her hand, her fingers tracing its frayed edges. It was worn, like hers, but carried a different insignia, a symbol she recognized immediately. She looked back at the man, a question in her eyes. He just nodded, his expression knowing and kind. "Another story for another time," he said, his voice low enough to keep their exchange private. "But I figured you'd understand." She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that softened the steely resolve she had shown earlier. Sliding the patch into her bag alongside her own, she nodded in silent acknowledgement. For a moment, they stood there, two strangers bound by shared experiences neither had to explain. The pit stop slowly returned to normal, the hum of conversation picking up again as people turned back to their meals and companions. The tension that had hung so thickly in the air was gone, replaced by a quieter, more thoughtful energy. As the woman sat back at her table, a waitress approached, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "That was something," she said, placing a fresh glass of water in front of her. "You didn't even have to throw a punch." The woman chuckled softly, shaking her head. "The strongest fights are the ones you never start," she replied, her tone warm but firm. "Besides, I've seen enough fights to last a lifetime." The tension was nearly unbearable now. A few diners shuffled in their seats, clearly debating whether to step in or stay out of it. One older man near the counter whispered to his wife, "She doesn't look like she's bluffing," but they both stayed put, watching from a distance. The leader wasn't backing down, though. If anything, her calm demeanor seemed to fuel his determination to save face. "All right, nurse," he said, his grin widening. "How about you prove it? Show us what makes you so tough." She tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Then, with deliberate slowness, she picked up her glass of water, took a sip, and set it down. "Be careful what you ask for," she said, her voice soft but cutting. "You might not like what you find out." And just like that, the tension snapped into something heavier. The challenge was out in the open now, and no one could look away. The leader leaned forward, his grin fading as he realized her calm wasn't fading. It was unnerving, the way she seemed so completely unshaken. The younger rider shifted nervously again, his fingers tapping on the edge of the table as if trying to signal the group to back off, but no one was listening. Pride and bravado had taken over now, and it was too late to turn back without losing face. The woman didn't move, didn't so much as blink. Instead, she let the silence stretch, every second making the riders more uncomfortable. Then finally she spoke. "Tell me something," she said, her voice steady and low. "You ever seen someone bleed out in front of you? Felt their pulse fade while they're begging you to save them?" The leader's smirk wavered, and he faltered just slightly before recovering. "What's that got to do with anything?" he shot back, but his tone lacked the confidence it had earlier. "Everything," she replied, taking a small step forward. "Because I have. More times than I can count. And do you know what I learned in those moments?" She paused, letting the question hang in the air, her eyes scanning the group like she was sizing them up. "You don't waste energy on people who don't deserve it. You pick your battles, and when you fight, you make sure it counts." The riders exchanged uneasy glances, the weight of her words sinking in. The younger one was now openly tugging at the leader's sleeve, muttering something about leaving. But the leader shrugged him off, doubling down instead. "All right, lady, you're a real tough act," he said, his voice louder now as he tried to mask his nerves. "But standing here telling stories doesn't prove anything. Let's see if you're all talk." She raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but calculating. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked, her tone almost casual. "Because if you take one more step, there's no turning back." The leader hesitated for just a second too long. The crowd around them seemed to hold its collective breath, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. And in that moment, the woman shifted her weight ever so slightly, her stance changing just enough to let everyone know she was ready. The leader took a half step forward, his bravado masking the hesitation flickering in his eyes. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, some whispering for someone to step in, others too intrigued to look away. The woman didn't flinch, her focus sharp as a blade, her posture radiating the kind of calm that comes from knowing you're 10 steps ahead. But before anything could unfold, the sound of an engine roaring into the lot broke the tension. A sleek black motorcycle pulled up, its rider dismounting with the ease of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a simple black jacket, not flashy, but it bore the unmistakable emblem of a unit patch. His helmet came off to reveal a weathered face, one that spoke of years in the field. His eyes scanned the scene, narrowing slightly as he took in the woman and the group of riders. "Am I late to the party?" he said, his voice calm but carrying an edge that immediately shifted the atmosphere. The woman's lips curled into a faint smile, the first real sign of emotion since the confrontation began. "Right on time," she replied, her tone as steady as ever. The riders froze, exchanging uneasy glances. The leader, caught off guard, tried to recover. "Who's this?" he asked, his bravado slipping. "Another one of your stories." The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, positioning himself just behind the woman, his presence amplifying the quiet power she already commanded. "Let me guess," he said, addressing the leader directly. "You thought you'd push her around, See how far you could go. Bad idea. The leader opened his mouth to respond, but the man wasn't finished. You don't know who you're dealing with, do you? She's not just a combat nurse. She's a survivor, a fighter, and the kind of person who doesn't walk away. The smell of smoky barbecue filled the air as the bustling roadside pit stop came alive with laughter, clinking plates, and the hum of idling motorcycles. A group of leather-clad riders, their jackets plastered with patches and slogans, rolled into the lot, their loud banter drawing the attention of everyone nearby. They swaggered to a picnic table, their voices carrying an edge of mischief and arrogance. Among the diners was a woman sitting alone at a corner table, quietly enjoying her pulled pork sandwich. She wore no leather, no patches, just a simple sundress and a pair of worn sneakers. But something about her calm, unbothered demeanor stood out. Her posture was steady, her eyes observant, and a faint scar ran along her forearm, a mark of past battles, though no one there could have known just how significant. It didn't take long for the riders to zero in on her, their loud remarks turning in her direction. One of them, a tall guy with a toothpick dangling from his lips, made a crack about her delicate appearance. The others joined in with chuckles, egging each other on. She didn't flinch. She simply kept eating, her eyes barely flicking toward the group. "Hey, lady," another called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Shouldn't you be knitting or something instead of hanging out here?" Still, she stayed silent, her focus on her plate. But anyone paying close attention could see it, the subtle tightening of her jaw, the steadying breath she took before finally standing up. The riders expected a timid response, maybe even some tears. What they didn't expect was the fire in her eyes and the quiet authority in her voice when she finally spoke. What she said next would leave everyone around stunned, and the riders wishing they kept their jokes to themselves. The woman's voice cut through the air like the sharp crack of a whip. "Knitting," she repeated, her tone calm, but laced with an edge that made the riders pause. "I've stitched wounds deeper than your ego, sweetheart. Want me to show you how it's done?" For a moment, there was silence, the kind that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. The riders exchanged glances, trying to gauge whether she was joking. But there was no humor in her steady gaze, only the kind of confidence that comes from someone who's seen more than her fair share of battles. Not just the kind fought with fists, but the kind that test your soul. The leader of the group, the guy with the toothpick, smirked and leaned against the table. "Oh yeah. And what kind of battles would a lady like you know about?" His voice was loud enough to draw a few curious looks from other diners, but most of the crowd stayed out of it, not wanting to get involved. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slowly wiped her hands on a napkin, as though she had all the time in the world. When she finally looked up, her eyes locked on his, and there was something in her expression, a quiet strength, a story untold, that made even him hesitate. "I'm a combat nurse," she said simply. "Served 3 tours in places you've probably only seen in movies. I've held soldiers together when they didn't think they'd make it home. I faced things that'd make your worst nightmare feel like a picnic. So no, I'm not afraid of you or your little jokes." The riders shifted uncomfortably, their bravado faltering. But instead of stepping back, their leader chuckled and crossed his arms. "Well, nurse, looks like you've got some fight in you. Let's see how far it goes." And with that, the tension thickened, the air buzzing with the unspoken question, just how far would it go? The pit stop grew quieter, the hum of conversations fading as more eyes turned toward the unfolding scene. The woman stood still, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, her calm a sharp contrast to the smirking leader and his restless crew. The air felt charged, as if everyone there could sense that something was about to break. One of the younger riders, a guy with a nervous laugh and a jacket that looked too new, muttered, "Maybe we should just grab our food and go, man." His words earned him a glare from the leader, who dismissed the suggestion with a wave of his hand. "No one's going anywhere," the leader said, his voice rising slightly as he turned back to her. "You think a few stories about patching up soldiers is supposed to scare us. You're just some lady with a lot of talk." Her lips curved into a small, almost imperceptible smile, but there was no warmth in it. Talk? Sure, let's call it that. She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow felt even more dangerous than shouting. But you're right, I'm just a lady. Nothing to be afraid of, right? The man lingered only briefly, giving her a small salute before heading back to his bike. She watched as he rode off, his presence leaving as quietly as it had arrived. As she finished her meal and prepared to leave, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the window. Her scars, once reminders of pain, now felt like badges of resilience. With a deep breath, she walked out into the afternoon sun, ready for whatever lay ahead. Some stories don't end with explosions or grand finales. Sometimes they end with a quiet lesson and the reminder that true strength lies in knowing when to stand tall and when to walk away.